start by talking a little bit about the David Olusegun documentaries on Empire, which are on BBC at the moment, three-part account of the British Empire. They're well worth watching. I like David Olusegun as a historian. I think the work that he did on the house in Bristol was terrific work. I think he's an historian who understands that if you're going to engage people with history, they've got to understand that it's in the archives. He's somebody who constantly goes back to the archives and seeks to draw out of what seem like dry text the real lives of people in the past. The Empire series has those strengths. It's told determinedly from the point of view of the victims of empire, not the perpetrators of empire. And I recommend that everybody takes a look at it, not least because it shows that genocide is the standard modus operandi for empire and not something that simply happens in exceptional cases. It spends a lot of time talking about the slave trade from the point of view of the slaves themselves. But, and it's an important but, I think it also has some weaknesses. It's told, as I say, from the point of view of the victims of slavery, and therefore it is very much a kind of inheritor of the history from below tradition that was pioneered in this country by the Marxist historians like Christopher Hill, Edward Thompson, and Eric Hobsbawm. But it lacks a dimension which the originators of that tradition always had. And the point of history from below in their hands was not simply that it was the story of the oppressed and the exploited. It certainly was that, and there was certainly an important dimension to it, which said that this is a history which has been excluded from the standard history of the great and the good, the kings and the queens, the rulers of society. But it was never just that. It was an attempt to portray the entirety of the society from the point of view of the oppressed and the exploited. It simply wasn't an account of their lives. It was an account of how the whole society was structured from their point of view. And those are two very different things. And it's clear what the importance of that difference is from Olusegun's account of empire, because it's an internal and subjectively based account of empire, and that in a way is one of its strengths. But what it lacks is a relationship to the overall structure of empire. So there is nothing about the relationship between the emergence of empire and the emergence of capitalism. Now that is an absolutely vital connection, because an internationally competitive economic system gave rise to an internationally competitive state system, and the one and the other have been symbiotically connected ever since the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company began competing for the control of empire, ever since the French and the British fought over control of America, as well as fighting the indigenous population for control over America. So that dimension of empire, that it's rooted in the accumulative drive of capitalist competition, and that it produces, and again this is completely absent from the Olusegun series, there is nothing about the competitive state nature. So from listening, you would think that the British Empire developed almost in complete isolation, that it wasn't desperately in competition with emerging Dutch or French or German empires or American empires, and yet you cannot conceivably tell the story of empire without that competitive framework as its determining feature, really. So it's quite interesting that when Olusegun comes to describe participation in the First World War, the description is about the way, and this is true of course and important to remember, about the way in which troops from throughout the British Empire fought on the British side in the First World War. But explanation of the First World War, of why that carnage took place in a particular moment of collapse for an international competitive state system, that just isn't even referred to in general terms. And I say this because there's a lot of post-colonial history which is of this model. Since the postmodernist term, relativist and subjective accounts, masquerading, I would say, as history from below, are very, very common, and structural accounts of economic and social structures, political competition, those are much, much harder to come by. And I say all this because we are living through one such moment of change, and to have that framework available to you, to me, is absolutely central to understanding it. We are passing from the so-called neoliberal globalization phase of capitalism and imperialism to a phase which is significantly different and is personified by Donald Trump's foreign policy. And it is making very, very significant changes to the structure of imperial competition and making it an even more dangerous and unstable system than it already was. Because what essentially is happening is that Trump, in response to the emerging global competitive nature of the system, predominantly the rise of China, but only the rise of China, the stabilization of the decline of the Russian Empire, the emergence of BRICS as competitive economies on a world scale. What Trump is attempting to do is to recalibrate American imperialism and reassert its place in the world by breaking up the old neoliberal globalized model. That is not Trump's model. Trump's model, let's put it this way, Trump thinks in the terms of a corporate executive, and he thinks about empire in the terms of a corporate executive. He's no longer running empire as if the corporation owned its own outlets throughout the world. He's franchising them out. He's moved to a franchising model of imperialism in which the various imperial partners are expected to bear more of the costs, but without more control. So he's really, part of the explanation of the unwillingness to rein in the Israeli state until the economic and political pressure of the solidarity movement with Palestine became so intense that it was impossible not at least partially to adjust to it, is the idea that Israel, in partnership with Saudi Arabia, always the twin pillars of American rule in the Middle East, the corrupt Arab dictatorships on one side, the Israeli state on the other, is to franchise out more of that business, and it is a business to them, in which the Americans will ultimately call the shots, but which the costs of administrating empire will be more heavily borne, both militarily and economically, by the Israelis and the Saudis and others of the dictatorship. In Europe, you have an unprecedented crisis where the Trump administration even went so far as to say last week that basically the Germans can take over NATO. Now this is a watershed moment. When NATO was formed, the first General Secretary of NATO famously said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. Now that formula doesn't apply in Trump's world. Trump's world is to franchise the costs of defending the European continent from competitors, primarily Putin's Russia, is to push the costs onto the European allies that ultimately have control of the operation, but not to be present in the same way that it has been since the formation of NATO at the end of the Second World War. Now, this fairly obviously makes it a very, very unstable international system indeed. And you can see it in the way that the European powers are reacting to the Trump-Ukraine deal. There is now a split between the European powers and the American state on a scale which didn't happen for the entirety of the Cold War. But although they dislike Trump's strategy, they've actually adopted his methods. So the entirety of European rearmament is essentially caving in to Trump's demand that Europe pay for its own defence. And the costs are enormous. The Financial Times estimated a couple of months ago that triple the area being used by defence companies had happened in the space of just less than a year. The primary Rheinmetall, the primary arms manufacturer in Germany, is taking over Volkswagen plants, idle Volkswagen plants, to build tanks. The shares of Rheinmetall rose 1,000% over the last 2 years. The demand of a 5% of GDP armaments budget in Europe is being met and is being demanded by NATO. If it happens in this country, and it's already on the rise in this country, but if it reaches that point, for the first time since the Second World War, defence expenditure will exceed education expenditure in this country. There will be 5% spent on armaments, and there will be 3.5% of GDP on education. So this is a shifting and dangerous world, and the burden of it is being pushed dramatically and economically, as well as politically, on to the working population of Europe and beyond. So that's the world in which we're facing, and I believe that we have to respond to it. We took an important step, and I'll conclude on this. We took an important step at the Paris Peace Conference last October. 4,000 people, delegates from 18 different European countries, beginning to put the argument of wages not warfare, which is now TUC policy, of welfare not warfare, of no to rearmament, that we won't bear the cost of war, either in lives or in money, at the heart of political developments. We have agreed that there will be a second international peace conference in London in June. We've already booked Central Hall, Westminster. It's an opportunity to go into every community, every single trade union branch, every mosque, every church, every community, and get it to send delegates to that conference to begin to reorient and redirect the anti-war movement to build the task, to be able to confront the task of the new imperialism. Thank you very much.